How has your week been, Lenny?
My week has been excellent. I watched the Golden Globes last weekend and I declared it Golden Globes Day and just like ordered in and I got like all made up and fabulous and then laid in bed under my covers, all fabulous, and watched the Golden Globes.
That is one, absolutely incredible, and two, not dissimilar to experiences I had as a closeted teenager living in Deer Lodge.
Yeah, well,
How were the Golden Globes?
racist, but good. I mean, it was
Wait, an
fun.
award show? Are you sure? That doesn't sound right.
Yeah, no, it was fun though. Um, like Jane Fonda is kind of a badass. I think we need to do an episode on Jane Fonda.
Oh, we absolutely should do an episode on Jane Fonda. A real advocate for social change, using her considerable privilege,
Yeah.
and vilified by propaganda in the 1960s. Fantastic story, that Jane Fonda. And it would give us an excuse to talk about the band Duran Duran because they got their name from the mad scientist in the film Barbarella.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about Jane Fonda movies. It must be SJW, social justice weirdos. I'm joyless feminist Charlie McCorn. I use they, she pronouns.
And I am Lenny Peppers. I use she, her pronouns.
So on this podcast, we go through and sort of talk about the world, our areas of study, and individuals who had a big impact in the world of equality. And sometimes we talk about real fucking monsters. This week, we're talking about, I'd say, the greatest monster of all. Like, some people want to say that Godzilla, king of the monsters. First of all, Godzilla is clearly gender fluid, lays eggs in a couple of those movies. Two, maybe Dracula. Dracula is the king of monsters? No, thank you. The real king of monsters, the American president.
Ah, yes. I was actually going to watch, by the way, the Godzilla movies this week. I haven't seen any of them ever. And so I had somebody pick the top 8 to watch, and I'm just going to watch one a day for the whole 8-day week that I have.
So cool. Do you have the titles on hand by any chance? Is that too much of a distraction from our podcast? This is something I need to know.
No, but I'll text them to you.
Yes, please. That sounds good. But much like the great kaiju, the American president comes and returns again and again for new generations, bringing destruction in its wake, and not always destruction. There have been, I think, some genuinely good people that have held the office of the U.S. president. However, I think the fact by them having being the role of the president inherently puts blood on their hands forever. Because as we know, the United States is not great about not being fucking awful.
Yep.
So the reason I wanted to talk about this is that the American presidency was always an area of focus for me in my historical studies. I've studied pretty... Yeah, I know. It's bananas, isn't it?
Me too.
It might be because I lost my virginity on President's Day, 2006.
What? Me too.
Oh my gosh.
I already had like 4 kids by 2006. But,
well, you didn't know where you got them from. No, it's the stork delivered them, as far as I know.
One of them's birthday is right around President's Day. I am actually starting a podcast. Surprise!
Oh boy, your empire continues.
Yeah, I've been working on it. All of the pre-production stuff is done. All I need to do is start recording. And so it is called Commanders and Chiefs. And it's about Native American president relations. And I start with George Washington and I work my way all the way up to Joe Biden. And yeah.
First of all, let me say that is the best fucking title I have ever heard. Congratulations on that bit of genius, Lenny.
Thank you.
Bask in the glory of that. That's great, too. Great podcast. I cannot wait to listen to and be a frequent guest.
Yeah. Now that I know how into presidents you are, I will totally make you a freak.
To be fair, I think you knew how into presidents I was. I mean, you heard me say all of their middle names like 2 times a week for at least a year.
Yeah, but I thought you were into middle names, not necessarily presidents.
I'm into both. It's actually, I'm a very complex individual.
Yeah, you're complicated.
I'm complicated. But I wanted to start sort of talking in a series of episodes that I'm going to be sort of running here about the American presidency.
Okay.
So I think that there's a lot of things that we can really talk about. And the first thing I want to talk about is a president that I think really fucking sucks. I know that that's, people say, "Well, Charlie, like, who's your favorite president?" And I say James Abram Garfield, like right off the bat. I'm not saying that that guy was perfect, not saying that his hands were clean. What I'm saying was the kind of leadership that he displayed, and not just in getting shot. Let me just be very clear about this. I'm not advocating, I'm not saying that he's a good president because someone shot him. He kind of was, though, which we'll get to in a second. But he was a good leader. He was a good man. Obviously the president, blood on his hands. Worst president, I think we need some time to like get away from the last batch that we've had over the last like 20 years. We'll say really have some time to separate and see how terrible things were. I know who I think is the fucking worst, and I think it's one that happened very recently. But I want to talk about how much I hate Ronald Wilson Reagan. Like I really want to sort of
Okay.
discuss this unbelievable rise to power, and specifically how the role of his assassination attempt played in America's perceptions of themselves and of themselves around the world. To do so, I first have to talk about presidential assassinations, something
Okay.
that I'm also super into. I'm going to recommend two books to our listeners. These are two books that help me out immeasurably. The first one is Assassination Vacation by Sarah Vowell, who's from Bozeman, BT Dub.
Hmm.
It's about her. It was written. I read it in high school, and it's actually the reason that I decided to study history in college.
Okay.
She tours the locations of presidential assassinations and sort of writes about the larger historical context and the full story that we get out of it. And then also, I want to recommend Destiny of the Republic by Candice Millard. She's a fantastic historian. All of her books are incredible. This one is about the assassination of James Abram Garfield, who we're getting into. And
Okay.
whenever it seems that a leader of a country is assassinated, a very interesting thing happens. So let's look to Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he did a lot, but his assassination still weighs heavily on the American consciousness. But at the time, we need to remember that America was the most divided it had, well, probably had ever. I mean, obviously, it had been up to that point. We were in the middle of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But Lincoln's assassination did a very interesting thing. Southern Army, Southern sympathizers, and anti-abolitionists were kind of kowtowed a little bit. Like, well, this guy is a martyr. Like they made this guy whose politics were very complicated. Let's not get that wrong. I mean, the vision of Lincoln freeing the slaves did not get down to, I think, to the real nitty gritty reality of that actual circumstance, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
But his death and that one large thing that he's remembered for his presidency deified him. It kind of united the
Yeah.
country. I mean, didn't really unite the country necessarily. But then let's jump forward to James Abram Garfield, who came just a couple presidents down. His whole thing, which I love, was at the Republican National Convention of that year. It was a wildly bitter fight for the candidate. Some people were backing Ulysses S. Grant. Some people were backing third-party people. Like people were one guy whose name I do not remember. Whenever he would get up and people would boo him because he was talking, he would just like start sucking on a lemon that he carried in his pocket and make a really sour face. Politics has always been insane. But they say, well, you know what we should do? Hey, we all really like James Abram Garfield. Let's have him read the nomination for president. And the speech that Garfield gives at this convention is so powerful. And his whole sort of thesis was, listen, friends, we're not picking the president here. The average American at home is picking the president. These people who have problems that we do not know about, they're picking it. We're just a circus right now. Everyone's like, oh, yeah. And then over like a series of incredibly like more dramatic votes, James Garfield, who wasn't even an initial candidate, becomes the Republican nominee for president in this election.
Wow.
So here's where things are going to get a little wacky. We're going
Okay.
to talk about this cat named Charles Guiteau, one of my
Okay.
favorite people from history. I almost want to do the whole episode on him, but I didn't think that doing an episode on a presidential assassin would be like the most fun topic. But he was insane. Like he had severe mental health issues.
Mm.
He survived a terrible riverboat accident at a very sort of formative time where he just was on this boat that was on fire and was sinking, and he was able to just like safely and with no real problem step onto the dock. Like he was able to just like ride out this whole thing completely unharmed, unmolested, and alive in this disaster that killed hundreds to thousand people, I would say.
Wow.
And his thought is like, oh, I'm chosen by God. I'm going to do something great in my life.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Which I get. Fortune's fatal finger always finds the most interesting targets to point at. He briefly spent time in an upstate New York sex cult that believed that the second coming of Christ was in the year 100 AD, and therefore we've been living on, we've had heaven on earth ever since. And as such, we should only eat vegetables and have sex with whoever we want. Here's the problem, is that it was also a very consent-based cult, and so no one wanted to have sex with Charles Guiteau. They're like, no, his nickname was like, hey, Charles, get out.
Oh, gosh.
Long story short, he starts campaigning for Garfield. And he thinks that when Garfield wins, I've done such a good job campaigning, I've written this amazing pamphlet, I'll be rewarded with an ambassadorship to France. Garfield wins the election. And this is very common during politics of this time. In fact, one of the big kind of like key pieces of legislation from this time is that when new administrations would come in, they would fire all civil servants from the last administration, like everyone, clerks, mayors, like not mayors, but like clerks, judges, everyone, and then replace all the way down. And sort of through a lot of fighting in Congress, it came around to be like, well, no, let's not replace everyone. That's ineffective. And so people would expect to get jobs when there's a new president. Guiteau comes up to Garfield and says, hi, it's me, Charles Guiteau, your biggest supporter, like your number one fan. I'd like to be ambassador to France, please. Garfield says, I do not know who you are. I'm not going to do that. Please have a nice day. So then Guiteau thinks, oh, wow, this president is a tyrant. I'd better shoot him and I'll be a hero.
Oh.
And the first part happens. Garfield is changing trains, and Guiteau comes out and shoots him in the stomach. It doesn't kill him. The more real story is more complicated. A terrible doctor, whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. The guy that was in charge of treating the president didn't believe in germ theory, which, to be fair, a lot of people didn't at this time. It was still a very new thing. And the president died of a massive infection 3 months later, which was actually Guiteau's defense on the stand. Like, hey, I didn't kill the presidents. It was those crooked doctors. Guiteau hangs for his crimes. Writes a hymn before he's led to the gallows. It's, I am going to the Lordy, I am going to the Lordy, I'm going to the Lordy. Here's what happens. Garfield's death unifies the American people. Still bitterly divided.
Most of the American people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Most of them.
Didn't like Native Americans, was mad that they had unpronounceable names and crude clothing, and said that it was a mockery for representatives to sit down in a wigwam with Native Americans. So not really.
God damn it! See, like I said, every president, blood on their hands, and as we're going to see in your new podcast and seeing here, none of them have had a good relationship with Native American communities. I'm going to say none of them have. I'm going to say it's probably been like genocidal at one level, up to antagonistic at the best, is my guess.
Paternalistic.
So Garfield dies, and a large portion of the population kind of has to like unite to get over the Civil War.
Wow. Yeah.
Same thing happens almost with John F. Kennedy in 1963, where he's shot by a mentally ill man who thinks he'll be rewarded as a hero of the socialist movement. It's complicated. But then we get to Reagan, who, as we know, was the movie star actor, the governor of California that completely privatized the public school system. So another book, Rawhide Down, The Near Assassination of Ronald Reagan. It was written by Del Quentin Wilbur. I read it a couple years ago. fantastic book, a minute by minute sort of following of the near assassination of Ronald Reagan, where he was likewise hit by an assassin's bullet. This, however, was incredibly early in Reagan's presidency. And people were unsure if this movie star could really do it. However, much like the previous assassinations that we spoke about, and I know, hey nerds, I know that I skipped over William McKinley. That's probably also a conversation for another day too.
Mm-hmm.
But the early 1980s kind of came around Reagan. It's like, look at this guy. He survived an assassin's bullet, and he was making jokes the whole time. He joked with his wife. He joked with the doctors. Famously, as he went under anesthesia, he said to the doctors, "I hope you boys are all Republicans." But, okay, this episode is about the American presidency, but we're sort of focusing it around Ronald Reagan. His mishandling of the AIDS crisis is one of the most egregious crimes, I think, in American history. There were so many people. There's a generation of people that were wiped off of the face of this planet, and he did nothing about it. And I think that's one of the worst things that he did.
Yes.
But his assassination, again, united large parts of the voting base, maybe is the way that we can politely say that. His wife, however, Nancy Reagan, also a movie star, was so horrified by this whole circumstance that her husband was shot and went through this whole series of things. She turned to the occult.
Well, I mean, aren't we all just kind of... I know I could speak for myself when I'm saying I'm just like one major disaster away from straight up turning to the occult.
I feel like that's kind of where I'm at. I feel like I decided to just... Like, yeah, all right, fine. I'll be a witch.
Yeah.
Estrogen. I get it.
I mean, I've started buying the books. I mean, I think we're all right there. I'm on Nancy's side with this one.
Yeah. So Nancy Reagan first met Joan Quigley on set of a TV show that they were both guests on, as they were both big celebrities. She, of course, being the actress, and Joan Quigley was a famous medium, a famous psychic. After this assassination attempt, which was in March of 1981, we're actually coming up on the 40th anniversary of the Reagan assassination attempt.
Oh.
Nancy Reagan reached out to Quigley and said, "Hey, could this have been prevented?" And Quigley was like, "Oh, absolutely. Like, the spirits could have absolutely prevented this from happening. I could have seen it, and I could have warned you. I could have done all of these things."
Wow.
For the rest of the Reagan presidency and the rest of Nancy Reagan's sort of political career, Joan Quigley was her number one kind of advisor. She listened to her every day on all of these things.
Would you say that she was like the Long Island medium of the 80s?
I would say so. I would say she'd probably be like even like a Long Island like big.
Ah, I like what you did there.
Thank you very much. And it wasn't until like halfway through like the sort of the mess of the Iran-Contra affair, which, okay, by the way, I mean, the AIDS crisis is very personal to me.
Mm-hmm.
But the Iran-Contra, it's so stupid. Like, so many things the American president does is just incredibly stupid. It, regardless of political affiliation or office, the actions that they take usually have the ability to embarrass the country. I'm not saying presidents haven't done good things. Don't tweet at us. Good things have happened because the right person was in office at the right time. But even like Jimmy Earl Carter,
Yes.
who was just too nice of a guy to be president, like, is still building houses into his 90s because he's trying to make up for the shit that he did in the Oval Office.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of how I feel about the larger versions of political violence, which is a really hot topic issue right now in the news. There's been, political violence throughout American history, throughout the origins of it to now. But, and I'm not just talking about, like, again, genocide of indigenous people. I'm not talking about the enslavement of Africans. I'm not talking about even Greg Gianforte attacking a reporter physically and throwing him to the ground because he asked a question about fucking healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
But I am, I just got mad at Greg Gianforte again. I'm sorry. I forgot what I was going to say. Give me a second. What was I talking about, Lenny? Bring me back.
You're talking about political violence.
And so obviously, you know, the political violence that sort of comes from radicalization, which we are obviously seeing a great deal of. I'm just going to say across the political spectrum. I
Yep.
mean, obviously, this is what happens when the world is turned on end for an extended period of time. I remember in college, a professor of mine saying that it was strange the United States had just like two political parties that were just one turn away from each other, like just almost the
Mm-hmm.
same, but with differences. Where Europe obviously has long-standing history of radicalization and far left and far right politics to various levels of genocide, obviously. And I think we're seeing sort of a change in the American system, and I think the role of the American presidency. In the case of Ronald Reagan, who was this complete outsider, who was going through the White House and obviously losing his mental faculties, and sort of based up around this idea of American exceptionalism, and still just being someone that completely bungles a pandemic response. It's just kind of unbelievable that Ronald Reagan still has sort of the love that he does, and the reason why is that his bullshit ideas of trickle down economics, his ideas of Reaganomics in general, don't work. The only reason I think he gets kind of a pass is that because George H.W. Bush, who I have complicated feelings about, but George H.W. Bush, I think, at least at some point, did a lot of the economic work that William Jefferson Clinton gets a lot of the credit for. But that's kind of the problem with this idea of deification of politicians.
Yeah.
And I think there's obviously too much of that, for the Reagan administration or for anyone else.
Yep.
But, we can't be resting on our laurels because our democracy is in peril.
Absolutely. 100% all of that.
I feel like I got a little rambly there because I get really excited about this. But that is something about Ronald Reagan is I cannot believe that, especially seeing how politics has progressed, in the 40 years since someone took a shot at Ronald Reagan, that we are at this point where politics just seems completely unhinged. Like there's no quote unquote like baseline of decency anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And on one side, we have a lot of very traumatized people reacting to their trauma and now having a voice to do it. And on the other hand, we have, actual fascists. And in the middle, we have an American people that's kind of getting inundated. And I'm not obviously saying like, ooh, they bad. I'm not, okay, one, I'm not doing a bad people on both sides. Very clearly, fuck fascism.
Mm-hmm.
We would not have as much trauma in the world as we have now without understanding that people will hurt people. People will find any excuse to exclude, to hurt, and to kill people.
Yeah.
To quote one of our favorite authors, Jude Doyle, we're more likely to be dead blondes than final girls.
Yep.
And that's sort of the point where people talk about this idea that politics needs to be civil. But there are so many groups who have been working for those civil rights that are still being denied to them and are still being direct targets of the inequality that is, again, baked into every stone of this country that we're built on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the system that we have needs a lot of work to be fixed, but I think it is fixable. But we need to be the ones that fix it. We can't put this off. We all need to be responsible for the progress of this country, and to not, fall down to the glitzy Hollywood stereotype of these larger than life personalities when they're really just people.
Absolutely.
And so that's sort of my feeling on the American president, is that there are some incredibly interesting people that have held the office of president. I would even dare to say that there have been good people who have held the office of the presidency, but none of them are innocent.
Exactly.
And we need to quit putting partisan politics in the way of the well-being of everyone, period.
Yep.
I know I'm fighting my horse on the soapbox here, but this is how I feel, and I've been wanting to talk about this.
Yeah. When it comes down to it, presidents are humans, and we need to force them to have humanity. I mean, that's what it comes down to. They're just humans. We cannot deify them, or else, a lot of big problems come up with it. We need to be like able to say, hey, that was a thing that they did. That was wrong. That was bad. To every single person in office. Even if you really, really like them, to be able to say they did some good things and they did some bad things. And
Yeah, we need the full picture.
right.
We need to recognize that they are humans and they are not comic book heroes. They are not professional athletes. They are politicians. They are trying to manipulate us. Are there any good politicians that you can think of off the top here? Let's not talk about. Actually, no. Let's not talk about that. James cut that out. That would be too much of a bummer this late in the show.
Yeah.
So, do you have any questions about anything that I talked about, that I rambled about the presidency?
No, I don't. I am absolutely behind you on everything that you said. And
Awesome.
I'm super excited to see what kind of topics that you have coming up on this topic.
Yeah, I'm looking forward, I think, to talking a little bit. And I should say too, I didn't mention, Mary Todd Lincoln was also a big believer of psychics. She went to visit mediums after the death of her son and her husband for many years. I don't know. I needed to throw that in, but
because I think we need to do an episode on psychics and political relations. I mean, I touched on it when I talked about seances and Native American reform, but I'm sure that there's a bigger picture there that we can talk about like a little bit more like broadly.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. Well, in that case, is there anything else that we need to add before we get out of here?
Nope. I don't think there's anything we need to add. My episode next week will be on how all Americans are still being colonized using methods that the American government used to colonize Native Americans, and they're doing it to you right now, to this very day.
I like I like this cliffhanger. Like, well,
yeah.
And I'm like, what are they? I need to know. I don't have a whole week. I don't want to be colonized anymore. Well, all right. Well, then, for Social Justice Weirdos, I'm Charlie McCorn.
And I'm Lenny Peppers.
Remember, you might not be able to change the world, but you can throw a brick.